In 1911, Frederick Taylor made a choice. He chose to standardize execution, to suppress human variation so scale could happen. Most organizations are still running his operating model, more than a century later. And the thing it was designed to suppress, individual judgment, is now the only thing left that matters. This episode is about what happens when the thing an operating model was built to suppress becomes the only thing worth keeping. Execution is leaving. Judgment is what stays. Stay with me. We're going back to 1911 first. I've sat in a lot of rooms over the last few years. Different industries, different sizes, different stakes. Founders, executives, line leaders, senior individual contributors, brand new hires, people at every level of every kind of organization you can name. And I keep hearing the same thing said in different vocabularies. From autistic professionals quietly burning out at the senior individual contributor level, the ones doing the actual hard cognitive work who keep being told to be more strategic or less in the weeds, from neurodivergent leaders running teams under operating models that were not built for the way they think, from executives who are running their actual cognitive work on AI inside meetings where AI was not supposed to be on the table, from middle managers who spend their days translating between layers and quietly wondering what they actually produced this week. The same thing, different words. The system is not broken. The system is working exactly as it was designed to work. And what it was designed to do is no longer the work in front of us. This episode is about what an operating model was built to do, what it was built to suppress, and what happens when the thing it was built to suppress becomes the only thing that matters. The frame I want to leave you with, the one sentence that should stay with you after you turn this off, is short. Execution is leaving. Judgment is what stays. I'm going to walk you through four layers. They have been forming for decades. They have converged in the last 18 months, and the convergence describes a shift most organizations haven't named yet, even though they are already inside it. If you take one thing away from the next 45 minutes, take this. The operating model most organizations are running was a deliberate design choice made in 1911 for a specific economic purpose. We forgot it was a choice, and the conditions that made it the right choice are ending. Stay with me. We're going back to 1911 first. The choice we forgot was a choice. In 1911, Frederick Taylor publishes a small book called The Principles of Scientific Management. It is the first systematic attempt in the history of human work to design how work happens. Until Taylor, the world had relied on artisans for thousands of years: trade artisans, craft work, local production, individual judgment baked into every output. Scale was not the goal, meeting needs was the goal. The industrial era, through the rise of capitalism, changed that fundamentally. Scale became the goal. Meeting needs got swapped for maximizing impact. And the only way to make that switch at the speed and at the volume the industrial era demanded was to standardize execution. Here is what standardizing execution required. It required breaking labor into discrete, repeatable units. It required specifying every step. It required making workers interchangeable so the absence of any one worker could not stop the line. It required measuring output in tasks per hour. And this is the part most people skip past. It required minimizing individual variation because variation in a system optimized for predictability was friction, and predictability was what gave you scale. The assembly line is the most visible expression of this design. The assembly line is not the deep contribution. The deep contribution is the operating model itself, a complete architecture for how humans and organizations would produce value for most of the 20th century. I want to pause on the word design for a second. Taylor's operating model was not an accident. It was not the way work had always happened. It was a deliberate design choice, made in a specific economic moment to solve a specific economic problem. The problem was, how do you scale production by orders of magnitude without depending on the local judgment of individual artisans? The answer was you remove individual judgment from the work. Read that with me one more time. The operating model that built the 20th century was designed to remove individual judgment from work, not because individual judgment was bad, because individual judgment was the bottleneck on scale. It worked. It produced the prosperity of the industrial era. It launched globalization. It gave rise to the organizational charts we still draw today. It made process engineering essential. It enabled the adoption of factory machines at mass scale. It is one of the most successful operating models in human history. And here is the move that matters for this episode. More than a century later, more than a century, most organizations are still running it. Not deliberately, by inheritance. Most leaders today did not choose this operating model. They walked into organizations that already had it. They learned it as how work happens. They never had the moment of realizing that this was a choice made by someone else for a specific reason in a specific economy that does not exist in the same form anymore. The choice was made. We forget it was a choice, and we are now living inside the consequences of forgetting. The industrial era made one move: minimize human variation to standardize execution. The conceptual era, and we'll get to what that is, runs on the inverse move: maximize human variation to design judgment. The operating model most organizations run has not made that switch. Now, the hardware of the work changed dramatically over the last 100 years. Factories gave way to offices. Physical production gave way to knowledge work. Computers the size of rooms shrank to desktops, and then to phones in our pockets. Ledger paper became Excel. Print presentations became PowerPoint. We started interfacing with screens more than with each other, and with each other through those screens, across a pandemic, and after. Through all of that, one thing did not change: the operating model underneath the work. The architecture of how thinking happens, how execution is organized, how decisions get made, is still the one Taylor designed for a different economy. This episode is about what happens to that operating model when the conditions it was designed for are ending. The offices inherited the factory. Scientific management's core insight was that work could be designed. Until Taylor, production happened through craft, individual skill, local variation, artisan judgment. After Taylor, production happened through process design. The process specified the steps, the metrics measured the outputs. Management reporting made the work legible at scale to people who are not on the line. When work moved from factories into offices in the middle of the 20th century, the vocabulary changed. The process, engineering, architecture transferred directly. Operating models were people, process, and technology, first in factories, then in offices. I want you to picture a factory floor for a second. Picture line workers, each responsible for one station on the assembly line. Picture line managers walking that floor, watching how the different stations of their section are working. Picture floor managers seeing how multiple sections combine into a complete production unit. Picture general managers overseeing the whole floor and how things flow into the factory and out of it. Now hold that picture in your head and look at the org chart of any large organization today. It's the same chart. It's still how organizational charts are structured, without accounting for the shift that knowledge work brought to the underlying nature of the work itself. Here's what that mismatch looks like in practice. Line workers in modern organizations don't own a smaller part of the process. They're the closest to the catalysts that produce large scale failures. Think about that for a beat. The people closest to the signal are structurally treated as the people with the smallest scope. Line managers spend their days managing the tension between top down priorities and bottom up realities that are blocking execution. They move from meeting to meeting. They translate between layers. Most of them, if you ask them honestly, can't tell you what they actually produced this week because they didn't produce things. They translated between people who produce things. Floor managers spend their days helping general managers understand what is happening on the floor. The floor is where the actual production is happening. The general managers are trying to maintain a grasp on a factory that is changing so fast and growing so large that they can only feign understanding of it. This is not a critique of any individual leader. This is what the architecture is doing. Inside this structure, organizations administer performance reviews built on factory quality control logic. Meeting culture becomes shift work with laptops. Executive presence is, let's be honest about this, compliance with visual standards inherited from a world where leadership presence had to project across a noisy factory floor. Reading the room and learning to fit in are the minimization of individual variations made into individual responsibility so that organizational output stays predictable. Now, here's where I want to bring in something the essay only points at. I am autistic. I have spent the last several years talking to autistic professionals and neurodivergent professionals at every level of organizations. Founders, executives, senior individual contributors, new hires. The thing that is universal, the thing that does not change across industries or seniority, is that the operating model we just walked through suppresses cognitive variation acutely. Acutely in a way that is hard to convey from outside the experience. Read the room, pick up the signals, adjust your tone, be more strategic, be less in the weeds, be more concise, be more thorough, be more polished, be more like the room. Each of these is on its surface neutral feedback. Underneath, each of them is the operating model running the movie was built to run. Minimize individual cognitive variation so that the output stays predictable. For a neurotypical professional, the move is mostly invisible. The accommodation is small, enough that it gets absorbed into professional behavior without comment. For a neurodivergent professional, and especially for autistic professionals, the move is structural. It is the entire weather of working life. It is what cognitive load research and burnout research is measuring without naming. This is what the neurodiversity movement has been raising for 30 years from an inclusion lens. This is what the brain economy has been raising more recently from a cognitive load and burnout lens. Both lenses are true. Both are partial views of the same architectural fact. The architectural fact is that the operating model itself is doing this on purpose because the operating model was built to do exactly this. It is not a bug in execution, it is the feature that the design was optimized for. And here is the part I want leaders to sit with. These are not failures of the operating model. They are the operating model working exactly as designed, producing predictable output at scale by minimizing the very variation that artisans honed for centuries, now applied to cognitive work instead of physical work. The industrial operating model is still running, still doing the work it was built to do, applied now to human knowledge as the production. Hold that. Think about it. This signal is decades old. Around the time the industrial operating model was reaching its post war peak, observers across many fields started noticing that something about the work itself was changing. I want to walk through several of them slowly because each one was reading the same shift from a different angle, and the angle each one took matters. Barry Oshry spent 40 years studying how organizations operate. Across thousands of hours of direct observation in real organizations, he described a pattern he called system sight. System sight is the capability to perceive the system shaping behavior, not just the events happening inside the system. He framed system sight as a leadership capability that would become more important as organizations grew more complex and more interdependent. He was writing this for decades. Most leadership development never absorbed it. Daniel Pink published A Whole New Mind in 2005. Pink's argument ran in parallel to Oshry's, from a different angle. The skills that define knowledge work, analysis, expertise, linear reasoning, were beginning to commoditize. Automation was compressing them from one direction. Global labor markets were compressing them from the other. The skill premium was shifting toward capabilities that compose across domains: synthesis, pattern recognition, meaning making, judgment under ambiguity. He called the emerging period the conceptual era. Oshry and Pink were reading the same shift from different angles. One described the capability the shift was selecting for, the other described the economic conditions doing the selecting. They were not alone. Peter Drucker had been writing about knowledge work since 1959. The whole concept of the knowledge worker is his. Howard Gardner, beginning in 1983, his work on multiple intelligences reframed the idea that cognitive range could be reduced to a single measure. There was not one kind of intelligence, there were many. The neurodiversity movement, emerging in the late 1990s, named cognitive difference as design variation rather than disorder. This was a profound reframe. The same set of cognitive characteristics, attention, processing, sensory weighting, energy allocation, that had been described in clinical terms for 100 years was now being described in design terms. Different cognitive architectures, different specifications, different optimal contexts. The brain economy thesis, formalized in recent World Economic Forum work, including a 2026 report titled The Human Advantage: Quantified Cognitive Infrastructure as Measurable Economic capital, brain health plus brain skills became a balance sheet category. The cognitive load and burnout research that had lived in clinical and HR contexts for decades suddenly had an economic vocabulary attached to it, and then an economic argument behind it. These movements, developed independently, different fields, different decades, different vocabularies, none of them coordinated with the others. They were each tracking a piece of the same larger shift. The shift in one sentence: from an economy optimized for predictable output by minimizing human variation to an economy that requires maximizing human variation to design the judgment AI cannot produce on its own. The shift is not new. What is new is the pace. The forcing function. The pace changed in late 2022. That is when generative AI became broadly usable. Not a research curiosity anymore, not something a small team in a lab was experimenting with, something a knowledge worker could open in a browser tab and use to do their actual work in real time on the actual deliverable they were trying to produce. The capabilities that define the knowledge era's skill premium are now being routed to AI: drafting, summarizing, analysis, coordination, research synthesis, reporting, first draft production across almost every category of knowledge work. Timelines that used to be measured in 5 years, increments of 5 years, are now measured in quarters. Inside most organizations, this isn't theoretical. Employees are already using AI and personal devices to do their work, whether leadership has authorized it or not. Adoption is moving faster than governance. The leaders responsible for designing how work happens are often the last to see what the people they lead are already doing. The work the industrial operating model was built to organize at scale is the work leaving humans first, not in the future. Now, this is the observable state of knowledge work in April 2026. And this year, this same pattern began on the physical side. Ernst& Young, EY, published a brief this month on physical AI. Physical AI is the term for machines that sense their environment, reason about what is happening, act autonomously, and adapt in real time. Robots execute predefined tasks in stable environments. Physical AI adapts. It is entering transportation, warehousing, healthcare, logistics, and manufacturing. Physical execution, the work factories were built to extract from humans, is now being extracted from the factories themselves. The EY brief frames it precisely. The intelligence layer matters more than the hardware. Data pipelines, simulation, models, reasoning engines, modernized infrastructure, workforce preparedness. EY is describing an organization's cognitive architecture in its own vocabulary without using the phrase. The same idea is emerging across different fields in different vocabularies at the same time. That is usually how a genuine shift announces itself. Here is the line I want you to carry: AI is not the cause of the shift. AI is the forcing function that makes the shift impossible to defer. The shift was already in motion. Drucker, Oshry, Pink, Gardner, the neurodiversity movement, the brain economy, all describing it in different vocabularies for decades. AI is what made it impossible to keep deferring. The convergence. I'm going to ask you to do something with me. I want you to put 4 layers in your head, one at a time. We're going to stack them. This is the part of the episode where audio has to do the work that a diagram does on the page. Layer 1: an operating model designed for the industrial era and adapted for knowledge work. It organizes work by minimizing variation. It rewards predictability. It optimizes for tasks that can be specified in advance. Layer 2: decades of signal from observers across many fields: Oshry, Pink, Drucker, Gardner, the neurodiversity movement, the brain economy, all of them in different vocabularies, saying the same thing. The work of the 21st century would require capabilities the industrial operating model was not built to cultivate: system sight, synthesis, cognitive centered organizational design, judgment under unprecedented pace of change. Layer 3: AI now moving low stakes cognitive execution off the table, enhancing high stakes cognitive execution, leaving judgment to be preserved as the human contribution. Not because anyone designed it that way, because that is what the technology actually does to the work. Layer 4: physical AI now beginning the same move on the physical side, in transportation, in healthcare, in logistics, in manufacturing. Stack them. Layer 1, Layer 2, Layer 3, Layer 4. A question forms on its own. If execution is leaving on both axes, cognitive and physical, What does the human contribution become? The industrial operating model was built on a single move: minimize human variation so execution could be standardized. Three forces now require the inverse move: neurodiversity made cognitive variation visible as design variation rather than deficit. The brain economy quantified cognitive infrastructure as measurable capital. AI compressed the timeline from in the next generation to this quarter. Separately, each of these could be deferred. Together, they describe a shift that has already occurred, even where no one has named it yet. Execution leaving is not the problem. Execution leaving is a fact. The problem, and I want you to hear this carefully, the problem is that work in organizations was designed to minimize variation at scale, and the three forces converging now require the opposite at greater scale than the industrial operating model was ever designed to govern. An operating model running past the conditions it was designed under does not fail in small steps. It fails exponentially. That is what we are watching now in slow motion across every industry. The inverse move, maximizing human variation so judgment can be designed, is what remains. I want to slow down on the word judgment for a second because the word is doing more work in this episode than it usually does in business conversation. Judgment in this frame is not a single cognitive operation. It is not a vibe. It is not experience. It is the deliberate composition of different frames on the same situation. How a technical lens, a systemic lens, a human lens, a strategic lens, and a temporal lens are brought together to produce a single decision. The more cognitively diverse the frames available to a decision, the more signal the judgment is built on. An organization running a single cognitive profile produces fast judgment, and it produces predictable blind spots. Speed times blind spot is eventually a strategic failure. An organization designed to compose many cognitive profiles produces slower, harder, more accurate judgment. That is the only kind of judgment that matters when execution has left. There is one more thing I want to say here because it ties back to the suppression of cognitive variation we were talking about earlier. The cost of cognitive variation was real in the industrial operating model. It slowed execution, it made coordination harder, it made workers less interchangeable. That cost is what AI now absorbs. The variation that used to be friction is now the asset because the work that required standardization is the work AI is doing. Read that with me one more time. The variation that used to be friction is now the asset because the work that required standardization is the work AI is doing. This is what observers across fields have been tracking in different vocabularies for decades. It is what neurodivergent leaders have been practicing and articulating, often without a platform, for as long as the industrial operating model has been running in offices. It is what the brain economy quantifies as brain capital. It is what AI and physical AI make concrete because they remove the work that was covering for the absence of cognitive architecture as a designed capability. The work that stays is the design of thinking itself. Four layers are on the table at the same time for the first time in history. An operating model designed in 1911 to minimize human variation for the sake of standardized execution. Decades of signal from Drucker, from Oshry, from Pink, from the neurodiversity movement, from the brain economy that said 21st century work would require capabilities the industrial model was not built to cultivate. AI absorbing cognitive execution, physical AI observing physical execution. The operating model most organizations still run was designed to suppress the exact thing now worth the most. Human judgment is not a productivity enhancement. It is the only thing that machine cannot replicate. And it has been suppressed for 100 years by an operating model most people forgot was a choice. Execution is leaving. Judgment is what stays. The blueprint. Three movements, one blueprint. I'm going to recap them tightly because they are the spine of this episode and I want them landing clean in your ears. The neurodiversity movement made it visible. The big move there is the reframe from deficit to design variation. Different cognitive architectures, different specifications, different optimal conditions, decades of lived evidence, and a movement that named what was true from the start. The brain economy made it economic. The big move there is the move from this is a wellness conversation to this is a balance sheet conversation. Brain capital, brain health plus brain skills, is now a measurable category of economic capital. The World Economic Forum has named it the defining organizational investment of the decade. That is a real shift in vocabulary, and vocabulary precedes action. The age of AI made it urgent. Execution is leaving. Cognitive execution to generative AI, physical execution to physical AI. What remains is the deliberate design of how thinking happens, where AI sits inside human judgment, how decisions are composed across cognitive frames. Every organization is now operating a cognitive architecture. The only real question is whether that architecture was designed deliberately or inherited from a different era. Three movements, one leadership imperative. Cognitive architecture is the convergence. And it isn't theoretical. I want to give you one concrete proof point because the worst version of an episode like this is one that lands in pure abstraction. Ultranauts, a software quality engineering firm, they built their operating model around cognitive variation as a design resource rather than friction. Hiring, rebuilt. Communication, rebuilt. Work allocation, rebuilt. Team structure, rebuilt. Each of these rebuilt from a premise that an industrial operating model does not support. They have been operating this way for over a decade. I want to be careful about what I'm claiming. Ultranauts is one firm. I am not claiming they prove the model works at every scale. I am claiming they prove the model has been possible the whole time. The organizations treating it as imaginary are the ones who have not yet begun. The shift, it's here. The industrial operating model produced the prosperity of the 20th century. It did exactly what it was designed to do. The structure Taylor built more than a century ago is one of the great design achievements in economic history. The conditions that structure was designed under are now shifting. Execution is leaving on both axes. The work that remains is the work that never the industrial operating models focus, because that work did not need to be organized at scale until now. Cognitive architecture, system site, deliberate integration of human and machine judgment. These are not new capabilities. They are capabilities moving from the margin of organizational life to the center of it. The organizations that begin designing their cognitive architecture deliberately will shape what leadership in the conceptual era actually looks like. That design work is available now at every level of every organization. It does not require permission. It does not require a budget line item. It does not require a transformation initiative. It begins with one question any leader can ask. So, what's the imperative? I'm going to leave you with that question. I want you to sit with it. Don't answer it now. Don't answer it on this drive or this walk or this train or this run. Sit with it for the week. Here's the question. Are you ready? What cognitive variation is your organization currently treating as friction that would produce better judgment if it were treated as signal? Sit with that one all week if you need to. Notice what comes up. Notice who comes to mind. Notice the specific behaviors and styles your organization is currently flattening. Notice the meetings where someone's frame got dismissed because it didn't match the dominant cognitive style in the room. Notice your own first reaction when someone offers a frame that lands sideways to the one you were holding. This is not a thought exercise. This is the beginning of designing your cognitive architecture deliberately. The shift is not new. The three forces underneath it have been building for decades. What is new is that they have now converged, and the operating model most organizations run was not built for what that convergence now requires. This is the biggest shift in how humans and organizations work since the Industrial Revolution itself. It is not coming, it is here. The architecture is yours to design. Start by sitting with the question: